Hi, and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine Celiac, RN, BSN, CEN. Today, during episode 44, we're going to talk about how to stay healthy in the hospital if you have to be hospitalized as a person with gluten intolerance, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, celiac disease, or any other food issue. Stay tuned. Hi, and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine Celiac, and today during episode 44, we're going to talk about how to stay healthy in the hospital if you have to be hospitalized. This is a very pertinent topic right now. I have a few clients and several friends in the hospital, unfortunately, so I'm getting firsthand experience once again on why to stay out of the hospital if you can at all help it. And I say that as a nurse, but if you have to go, then it's very important to know how to navigate being a patient or a patient's family member or friend while that person is in the hospital. So as many of you know, I'm not just the Gluten Free RN. I am also RN on call. So I have patients that I manage their healthcare. And one of my primary goals as a patient advocate is to keep people out of the hospitals. And if they do end up in the hospitals, I really work hard to get them out as soon as possible, because hospitals are not necessarily the healthiest places for people to heal or get better. So I happened to have a patient, a celiac patient, that did fall, and she unfortunately broke her hip. So it's a good thing I'm back from India and can help manage her surgeries and healthcare after that event. But what we quickly realized while she was in the hospital, and she doesn't have any choice at this point, is that the food that is even on a gluten-free menu in the hospital for the patients is not truly gluten-free. Please don't assume it is. My patient actually called down for breakfast with the help of the nurse, and she ordered some fried potatoes and an omelet and a few other things. So luckily, they delivered the food while I was there, and I made the phone call down to the kitchen, and I said, I understand that this is gluten-free, what you've delivered to my patient. And they said, well, yes, it was ordered off the gluten-free menu. I said, well, is it cooked on a different grill, or is it cooked on the same grill that you do pancakes and French toast and grilled cheese sandwiches? And she said, oh, no, we only have one grill. It's all cooked on the same grill. So the cross-contamination or contamination risk at that point is unavoidable. If it's not cooked in a separate pan, if separate utensils are not used, then that food is contaminated. There's no way around it. And as we've mentioned before, those gluten proteins are extremely heat stable, which means that temperatures do not denature them. So even at a high temperature, even in oil used in a deep fryer, those proteins are still there. It's very difficult to get rid of them once they are on a surface. So we knew that she couldn't eat her supposedly gluten-free food from the hospital kitchen. So we made arrangements to bring all of her food in, which has worked out at this point pretty well. She does live in an adult foster home where they do provide her with 100% gluten-free food. And so the nurse that actually provides that service brought her in omelets and salmon and a number of other things for her to eat while she's recovering from the hip fracture surgery. So this topic was actually requested by Patty Crosby. She herself is a celiac and also a nurse. She lives in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I really want to thank Patty for suggesting this topic actually quite a while ago, and just now getting around to it, but was prompted by the fact that, again, several people are in the hospital, and I was just reminded at how very difficult it is for people to eat gluten-free while they're in a facility. Now, I would imagine that some facilities are better than others. The ones in our community are not very good about providing gluten-free food. And because I'm a nurse and because I'm the Gluten Free RN, And because I have friends in the hospital, I like to check out the food that is available in places like the gift shops and the kitchens and wherever else people get food while they're in the hospital. Oh, by the way, check out the vending machines in hospitals. Oh my gosh, they're abysmal. And you can send me pictures. I'd love to see what's in the vending machines or in the hospital gift shops or kitchens where you live. And I don't care which country that is. I'm really interested in the food that is available in hospitals because it tends to be the most horrible food and not at all nutrient dense, most likely nutrient deficient and very high in gluten. So I went into the gift shop and there are saltines and there's those little crackers with peanut butter and cheese, and there's Lunchables, and there's energy drinks, which have nothing but sugar and caffeine in them. Basically, it looked like a gas station lineup of crap food or junk food that was available to people that either worked in the hospitals, were visiting people in the hospitals, or for patients. Not ideal, not at all nutritious in any way, shape, or form for anyone, let alone somebody that's trying to recover from a surgery or an infection or anything else. So I actually took those pictures. So if you look on my Instagram or my Facebook page, you might be able to find those. And everything is listed under the Gluten Free RN. You can find me just about anywhere as the Gluten Free RN. So on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And if you choose to follow me, I'll post lots of pictures and lots of very interesting things as time goes on. So one of the number one things we have to worry about in the hospital is medications. Most people in hospitals get medications. They're either on them before they come into the hospital, but they don't actually get to bring those medications into the hospital, not in the United States anyway. So the pharmacies are in charge of all the medications that a patient gets. So all of those medications for a celiac patient have to be checked every time to make sure that they're gluten-free. Now, Steve Plogstead runs a very nice website called glutenfreedrugs.com. And you can go to that website and you can look at all the updated information. Steve Plogstead is a pharmacist and he's phenomenal. He's lovely. And he's taken it upon himself to make sure that he has a valid resource for pharmacists and patients to check medications to make sure they're gluten-free. I recently had a pharmacy tech from the local hospital call me because she had a patient that was celiac disease and she wanted to make sure that all the medications were in fact gluten-free. That is great. I love that she called me. I love that I was able to give her some really good resources so that she could check the medications to make sure they were safe for the patient that was in the hospital. Now, if a pharmacist ever tells you that they don't have time to check the medications to make sure they're gluten-free, that it's, too much trouble, or that you need to check to make sure they're gluten-free, that's not correct information. Their job as pharmacists is to make sure that the medication you are getting is in fact safe for you. And if they don't have time for that, or they tell you that's not their job, please go find another pharmacist and call me, because I'm happy to call them up and remind them what their job is, which is to find out if the medication that you are receiving is safe for you. So that is all prescription medication, all over-the-counter medications, anything that's topical. And then on the same order, enteral medication, or medication that goes in through a feeding tube or an NG tube, a nasogastric tube, all of those enteral feedings need to be checked to make sure that they are gluten-free, dairy-free, soy-free, whatever free. Also, you can't assume that those enteral feedings are in fact gluten-free. One of the worst things you can do for a patient who is in intensive care or trying to heal is to give them an enteral feeding, which is a liquid nutritional supplement type feeding so that they can heal. One of the worst things you can do is give somebody that is celiac or dairy intolerant one of those enteral feedings that actually contains gluten or dairy or soy. You can cause irreparable damage. and unfortunately cause that person to not be able to get better or to die. And that is the reality of it. So you have to be very, very careful what nurses or doctors or pharmacists are giving to patients with celiac disease, because all it takes is a breadcrumb or a dusting of flour or a cross-contamination with gluten to cause a medical sequelae of symptoms that is very difficult sometimes to heal, especially if that is a repeated insult with gluten, either through a medication or an enteral feeding or the breadcrumb or the dusting of flour. So when you go into a hospital, whether it's planned or unplanned, please make sure that you have a band on your wrist that says that gluten is an allergy, or that you're gluten intolerant, or that you have celiac disease, or all of the above. Make sure it is very prominently labeled on the allergy band, on your chart, that it's on all of the records, whether it's on paper or computer. It really does need to be everywhere. Because the thing is, trust me, somebody will miss it, or they won't know what gluten is, and they will try to give you gluten. So Katie's story in my book, I keep referring to Katie, but she's a great source of a lot of information. Her stories are very poignant and telling. So she was in the hospital and everything was labeled. She had a band on. It was on her chart. It was supposed to be down in the kitchen. It was everywhere that she had celiac disease. Her family was very vigilant about making sure that everybody knew, and they double checked everything before she ate it. And poor Katie got told that in order to get out of the hospital, she had to eat breakfast. She had to be able to eat solid food. So instead of bringing her safe food for a celiac, they actually brought her cream of wheat and told her when she finished that, she could leave. If Katie would have eaten that bowl of cream of wheat, she would have been back in the hospital. She never would have been able to leave, and it would have set her back probably weeks, if not months. Thankfully, her family was there and stopped that whole event from unraveling. So it's always a good idea to have an advocate with you in the hospital, any doctor's appointment, wherever you go, that somebody is changing medications or addressing healthcare issues, or you find yourself in the hospital. You really need to make sure you have an advocate, whether it's a paid advocate like myself, a friend, a family member, somebody from one of the support groups that you belong to, especially if you belong to a gluten-free support group or a celiac support group. One of the things that we provide as support group members is support during events where people, need help feeding themselves. So make sure that your family and your friends have access to safe food for you and they can bring it to you in the hospital. That would be my recommendation, no matter where you are in the world, that you have people that can actually bring you food, because there's too many variables in a hospital. There are too many variables of different people, different shifts. There's food on the floor that nurses want to feed people or CNAs want to feed people when the kitchen isn't open. None of those things are going to be gluten-free. So you really do have to be hypervigilant in the hospital. Even after surgery, the nurses in PACU or post-anesthesia care unit want to give people crackers, or they want to make sure that they can hold something in their stomach without vomiting or having nausea. So it's very common for hospitals to have entire boxes and cases full of saltine crackers or graham crackers, which of course are not gluten-free. But that's the go-to thing for nurses to give to patients after they've had anesthesia, when they're waking up and still groggy from that surgery and that anesthesia. So patients aren't very good at self-advocating. So it's extremely important to make sure that that is planned for way before, if you have that opportunity, to make sure that those nurses are not giving you as a celiac patient a cracker that could potentially make you worse. Several years ago, I had a patient that called me in the middle of the night. I knew she was in the hospital, but she called me because the RD had been phenomenal as far as making sure that everyone knew that she was celiac and then what food she could eat, what food she couldn't eat, and really advocating for this particular patient. So the RD took care of everything. She helped the kitchen staff prepare the food. But the unfortunate thing is she did have to go home at some point. So in the middle of the night, when my patient called down to the kitchen to get a smoothie brought up, the person in the kitchen thought it would benefit the patient to have some protein powder mixed in with the smoothie. Unfortunately, that protein powder contained gluten. So my patient called in the middle of the night pretty much in tears, stating that she felt like she had glass going through her intestines and that now she had a GI bleed, which is never a good idea, especially when you're in the hospital for something else. But this particular patient felt whenever she got gluten that it was like glass going through her intestines. So the next day when the phenomenal RD found out about that, she herself was in tears. She felt so bad, but really there was nothing else she could have done or my patient. It was kind of a horrible situation. And obviously in the middle of the night, the people in the kitchen maybe don't have access to the patient's records or the chart, and they don't know what a patient can or cannot have. So it's always a good idea to consider when a person is on a liquid diet that you perhaps consider making some bone broth or some soup. Homemade is best. And what I always have pots of bone broth on the stove or in the crock pot. And right now I have 2 pots because I have several people in the hospital and I want them to get better. So I make bone broth and I will make that into some very nice soup, very nutritious, very healing to take into them so that they can have some bone broth while they're on a liquid type diet. And as their diet advances, which means that they can maybe have some soft food or some more substantial, more normal diet, then we'll make that soup a little bit more chunky with vegetables and other things. But it's very important that people that are in the hospital or just recently out of hospital have very nutrient-dense foods so that their bodies can heal from whatever they're recovering from, whether it's surgery, an infection, or a heart attack or a stroke. It's very important to have nutrient-dense foods, and you need to find out what that means. I'm also going to post the list of nutrient-dense foods that I give to everybody during the emergency preparedness class. Those nutrient-dense foods are good things that are shelf-stable, that if you're looking to take somebody food that's in the hospital or you're planning ahead because you know you're going to be in the hospital for a planned surgery or some procedure, that it's good to take those foods in with you. Now, you can just make a bag up. If you eat them, great. If you don't eat all of the things that you take, that's fine. But at least you'll have a safe stash of food that your family can help you eat out of. So just a bag of food. It can have whatever you like in it. Just make sure that whatever's in there is 100% gluten-free and it's not contaminated. Unfortunately, more and more foods that are labeled gluten-free either are cross-contaminated or they follow the standard of less than 20 parts per million, but they can be pretty close to 20 parts per million. So 18 parts per million, 19 parts per million. If you're eating several of those products that are, let's say, 18 or 19 parts per million through the course of a day, you're actually getting a fair amount of gluten. So be very cautious about which gluten-free products that you're eating and make sure that they're not, in fact, cross-contaminated. Because, of course, it's a bad idea to get hit with gluten while you're in the hospital. It's a bad idea even when you're not in the hospital. And, of course, getting hit with gluten has put people in the hospital. So it's a catch-22 to stay out of the hospital. But then if your symptoms are bad enough, when you do get hit with gluten, some of these people have to go into the hospital for dehydration, for GI bleeding, for a number of different reasons. And it's very difficult to stay gluten-free in a hospital. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to remain gluten-free in a hospital. I wish it was different, and I wish more RDs were knowledgeable about celiac disease and what it takes to stay gluten-free. I can assure you that even though I've given talks at hospitals and different places, there is still a resistance from the sometimes the doctors, sometimes the nurses, sometimes even the RDs to provide gluten-free food. And certainly the kitchens are not set up to provide safe gluten-free food. There's a huge difference between saying that you can provide gluten-free food and actually doing it. So another thing to keep in mind that if you have celiac disease or you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity or any other food issue and you have to take antibiotics, which unfortunately most people that go in the hospital either are given prophylactic antibiotic or given antibiotics because they have an infection, those antibiotics will wipe out good normal flora along with any bad bacteria. So it's really important to make sure that you're getting really good quality probiotics, that you're eating foods that are alive, which means that they're fermented, things like sauerkraut, kombucha, apple cider vinegar, things that are alive that actually have really good prebiotics and probiotics so that you can reestablish those microbiome after those antibiotic courses are finished. So anytime people are in the hospital, it's usually for an event. It's very unusual to go into a hospital if you're healthy. So it's the people that are at risk for getting sicker that are in the hospital to begin with. So it's really important that we make sure that people that are most at risk, that are vulnerable, are protected either by an advocate, a really diligent family member or friend, a support group member, or somebody that is appointed to make sure that the food that the person that is in the hospital and is vulnerable is protected from gluten. And we can't put people in a bubble, but we certainly can provide safe food for people. So it would be a good idea to assign some people before you are actually in a position of needing to be in a hospital. The people that are in the hospital this week, trust me, did not plan on being in the hospital. They were sudden events and not at all expected. So in both cases, these people had support people that could actually rally, throw some food into a bag that everybody knew was safe, and take it into the hospital with them. But there's always going to be events where people try to feed patients in the hospital, whether it's an RD or a nurse or a CNA, or even doctors sometimes, really try to get people to eat things that may or may not be safe for them. So you have to be vigilant. And even when you are vigilant, trust me, even when you're vigilant, even when you're communicating effectively and very clearly, there are going to be times when people just don't get it. So just say, thank you very much. You can take that out of the room. That's not safe. Maybe you need to get educated about what people with celiac disease can and cannot eat, or let them know I'm a resource and I'll happily come into their facility or to their physician's group or whatever to give a lecture about celiac disease, being in the hospital, what celiac disease is and what gluten is, and how to not make people sicker when they're in the hospital. I'm including in the podcast notes today, and please do refer to the podcast notes, several pages from the Gluten Intolerance Group of North America. And this particular one is entitled Hospital Stays Made Safe. And it was updated in April 2016. And there's several letters actually signed by Cynthia Cupper, who is the CEO of the Gluten Intolerance Group. She's an RD and a very good advocate for people in the celiac community and the non-celiac gluten sensitivity community. So Cynthia has actually provided letters that you can give to the pharmacy staff, to physicians, and in an effort to make sure that people are taken care of correctly. And they're very good information to have. So even if you just print these off to have them in your doctor's offices, in your emergency paperwork, in case you have to go to the hospital, it's another great resource to have. And of course, the Gluten Intolerance Group is another great resource overall. So if you want to look at their website, GIG, they're also known as GIG, Gluten Intolerance Group of North America, there's a lot of good resources there to be reviewed. So during episode 44 of the Gluten Free RN podcast, we reviewed some of the major key points of how to stay healthy if you have to be hospitalized. Ideally, we won't have to be hospitalized. We'll be as healthy as possible and we'll stay out of the hospitals and never have to deal with this. However, some of our family members may have to deal with it, or you may be called on to be the safe person or the advocate for a patient that is in the hospital. So just review the information provided today. Make sure that you're aware of what the situation is in your hospital or your local care facility so that even if they are offering a gluten-free menu, that may or may not be the case. And that's really good information to find out before you need to be in the hospital. Of course, one way to be safe is just assume that the hospital or the facility is not going to be able to provide gluten-free food for you and that you need to plan ahead as much as possible and make sure that you have an appointed advocate, family member, friend, or support group member who can actually fill that role for you and keep you safe. I can tell you as a nurse who has spent many years in the hospital, I don't like even going in to visit anymore if I don't have to. So I stay as far away from the hospitals if at all possible. But many times I do have to go in and advocate for either patients or clients or friends, sometimes even family members. And I really do encourage everyone to have an appointed advocate. Because if you're in the hospital, you are in a vulnerable position. Today, we've covered some of the main points, and there's many others. Every time I do a podcast, I think, oh my gosh, I forgot to mention that. Or, oh, that was a huge thing, and I should have talked about that. But I do the best I can in a short amount of time to give you the best information I can, and I will continue to bring more information with every episode. But just so you know, there's always more and more information to be talked about. Which leads me to say thank you very much for joining the Gluten Free RN, Nadine Gruskowiak, today during episode 44 on how to stay healthy in the hospital if you, in fact, have to find yourself there one day. These have been some key points, and I hope you review them a few times just to know that there is information to be reviewed and discussed with your family members and your friends, just in case you find yourself having to go to a hospital, either as a planned event or a sudden event. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope this has been great information for you. Just remember, if you think celiac disease doesn't affect you, your family, or your friends, think again. Until next time, this is Nadine Gruskowiak, RN BSN CEN, signing out. Stay safe and eat healthy. Bye.